unfold.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're undertaking a forensic examination. We are not looking at history as this beautiful, sort of inevitable story of human progress.
Yeah.
Instead, we're approaching what you might call a catastrophic scene, a cultural crime scene, to be exact.
That's a great way to put it.
And our focus today is on what is maybe the most devastating, truly unquantifiable loss of data in human history, the erasure of the Great Library of Alexandria.
You know, when most people think of Alexandria, it's this very romantic image, right?
You picture a single, huge, dramatic fire.
Exactly. A fire consuming all these dusty old scrolls.
Mm-hmm.
But the picture that the sources we've looked at paint is, well, it's far more complex. And frankly, a lot more chilling.
So it's not just about lost books.
No, not at all. Our forensic audit, if you want to call it that, it really suggests the main victim wasn't just literature or, philosophy. The victim was the collective intellectual momentum of antiquity itself. We are investigating, in effect, the aborted gestation of an industrial revolution. A revolution that, by all rights, should have happened 2,000 years ago.
And that distinction is just, it's so critical. It really defines our mission for you, the listener, today. We're going to try and measure the true quantifiable cost of this erasure.
Because it wasn't just a library.
Not even close. If you look at its structure, its operational output, it was the functional equivalent of a combined MIT research facility, a DARPA-style military innovation hub, and, the ultimate Library of Congress, all rolled into one.
All state-sponsored. A massive intellectual reactor core.
Right.
And you have to just completely discard this image of a timid, passive librarian. We're talking about a sophisticated, state-run research institute. It had aggressive acquisition policies, what seems like unlimited resources.
And a roster of geniuses.
Oh, a roster of resident genius that reads like the founding faculty of modern science. And the loss of this central database didn't just cause a pause in history. The evidence suggests it fundamentally reset the clock of scientific and technological progress by over 1,000 years. It locked humanity into this long, slow detour.
And this is the central idea, the thesis we have to carry through this entire deep dive. The library didn't just house the collected wisdom of the past. It wasn't just an archive.
It was an incubator.
It held the actual blueprints for a working steam engine. It had the operational mathematics that make up integral calculus and the confirmed knowledge of a spherical heliocentric universe.
And all of this was centuries, in some cases millennia, ahead of when we rediscovered it all during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment.
We lost the instruction manuals for the future. Okay, let's unpack this.
To really get a handle on the magnitude of the loss, we have to first analyze the design, the operational structure of the institution itself, what we might call the machine of Alexandria.
Because the Great Library wasn't conceived as, say, a public town resource?
Not at all. It was the bibliographic hard drive. It was the central server for a state-sponsored residential think tank called the Museum, the Institution of the Muses.
And we should be clear, this wasn't just a collection of scholars who happened to live nearby. This was a deliberate, almost artificial intellectual ecosystem.
It was. It was established by the Ptolemies, specifically Ptolemy Soter, one of Alexander the Great's top generals.
So imagine if a modern nation decided to just allocate virtually unlimited resources to capture the world's 100 best minds.
Across every discipline.
Right? Math, medicine, astronomy, engineering, and then told them, your only job is to generate new, applicable knowledge. That's what this was.
That is precisely the model. The structure was meticulously engineered to attract and, this is the critical part, retain the greatest minds of the entire Hellenistic world.
So how did they do it? What were the perks?
Well, they received not just distinct tax exemptions and free lodging, but a consistently handsome royal salary. This was a state commitment that elevated the scholar above the merchant, even above the general in some ways.
And that funding model, it created what the historical sources call a true pressure cooker for intellectual output.
It did. The scholars weren't just curators. They weren't librarians in our sense. They were state-subsidized, highly competitive, active researchers. Their whole goal was to push the envelope of human understanding.
It sounds less like a quiet, placid academy and more like a high-stakes, almost cutthroat research campus.
I think that's fair.
We have that famous quote from the satirist Timon of Phlius, who he clearly viewed these intellectuals with a bit of disdain.
He did.
He called them fatted fowls in a coop, squabbling for royal favor in the birdcage of the muses.
And even in his mockery, he's confirming the whole setup, this lavishly funded, highly concentrated intellectual environment. He saw it, even if he was making fun of it.
Right. The mockery proves the premise.
And this concentration, this system, it led to the bedrock texts upon which geometry, grammar, and astronomy were based for the next 2,000 years. It shows that the Ptolemies understood knowledge not as some cultural amenity,
Not a luxury.
but as a hard strategic asset. It was a deliberate state policy to, and I think this is the right phrase, weaponize knowledge for prestige and power. The museum was the engine, the reactor core of their dominance over the intellectual world.
And that translated directly into real-world power.
Absolutely. Commercial, diplomatic, military. Knowledge was power.
You mentioned the architecture itself was part of this. They didn't just give these great minds offices. They designed the physical space to force them to interact.
The design was absolutely key to their success. They had the covered walkway, the peripatos, which encouraged dialogue during exercise. It was designed for walking and talking.
Like Aristotle's school.
Exactly. Then they had the arcade, the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐓, which was furnished with seating for impromptu lectures, for philosophical debates.
And the dining hall.
And, perhaps most vital of all, they had the great dining hall, the oikos. This communal design was completely intentional because it forced the cross-pollination of what were otherwise siloed disciplines.
So you'd have the astronomer Eratosthenes sharing a meal with the mathematician Euclid.
And Euclid might be exchanging notes with the mechanist Archimedes, who's sitting next to the great anatomist Herophilus.
So theory meets practice over dinner.
Precisely. This synthesis is the true Alexandrian breakthrough. It meant that pure mathematics could merge instantly with geography. Mechanics were immediately applied to physics and biology. This level of integrated interdisciplinary research wasn't really replicated effectively until the 17th century.
With the establishment of the Royal Society of London.
Right. They didn't just have a collection of smart individuals. They designed the system to generate collective, integrated intelligence.
And their method of gathering the raw data, the fuel for this engine, was, well, it was equally aggressive, if not outright predatory.
I think it was.
This brings us to the famous ship search protocol.
This detail is maybe the greatest insight into the fanaticism of their data acquisition strategy. The library didn't just passively wait for scholars to bring their work. It didn't rely on standard purchasing.
No, this was state-sanctioned seizure.
It was. Alexandria was the trade hub of the Mediterranean. Any vessel, and I mean any vessel, regardless of its origin, that docked in their massive harbor was immediately subject to inspection.
But not for what you'd expect, not for illegal cargo or spices.
No, strictly for scrolls and books.
That policy instantly turned every merchant ship, every diplomatic vessel, into a mandatory, unwilling knowledge courier for the Ptolemies.
So what was the political fallout from a policy of, let's call it what it is, systematic theft?
You'd think it would be huge, but it was surprisingly little. And that's because the Alexandrians offered a very sophisticated, if ethically, let's say dubious, exchange.
Okay, so how did it work?
Once a scroll was found, it was confiscated, taken to the library. The experts there would then decide its value. In many cases, the original was retained for the main collection.
They kept the original.
And a freshly scribed, high-quality copy was returned to the owner, often with very generous financial compensation.
So they were essentially trading money for primary source data. They were buying the originals and giving back copies. They were. And crucially, these original volumes were meticulously cataloged in the library's pinakes as 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀, which literally means from the ships.
So they were tracking the source.
Exactly. This specific forensic labeling proves they were tracking the material acquired through this aggressive state protocol. It distinguished them from works that were purchased or donated. It shows they formalized this process into a standard operating procedure.
And this obsession with authentic data, this prioritization of the original text over any form of currency, there's no better example than that astonishing anecdote involving Ptolemy III, Euergetes.
That story perfectly encapsulates the Alexandrian view of value. Ptolemy III desperately wanted the official, authentic, state-certified text of the great Athenian tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides.
The master copies, essentially.
The master copies. So he requested to borrow them from Athens, and he deposited an enormous sum as collateral, 15 talents of silver.
Okay, we need to ground that number for the listener. 15 talents. What kind of fortune are we actually talking about here?
It's a stupendous amount of money. In the Roman context, a single talent could pay an average soldier's wages for decades.
For decades.
Or it could fund a small warship, a trireme. So 15 talents that could finance a minor military campaign. You could purchase hundreds of properties with that. It was a fortune.
And what did he do?
Ptolemy III deliberately forfeited the entire deposit. He just let them keep the money. He kept the originals for the library's collection and sent back only the copies.
He effectively traded a massive amount of bullion for data integrity.
And for cultural bragging rights. That is the mindset of a civilization that saw information as the ultimate, irreplaceable strategic asset.
It really was the world's first universal database project. And it was operating with a vast state-funded budget. The scale of it, by any measure, was just immense.
It's true. And while the precise numbers are notoriously difficult to pin down, due to the nature of ancient record-keeping and then the subsequent loss,
Of course.
the estimates for the collection range wildly, from a conservative 40,000 to, at its peak, an astounding 400,000 scrolls.
And given that an entire scientific treatise could often fit on a single scroll, the intellectual density of that collection is just, it's hard to fathom.
It is.
But 400,000 documents, even if they are scrolls, it's just a giant warehouse of unsearchable material unless you have an organizational system. And that's where the unsung hero of information science, 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒, comes in.
𝐏𝐿aimachus is so important. He wasn't the head librarian, but he was absolutely the intellectual force behind organizing this chaotic influx of data. He created the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒, which means tables.
And this was what, the world's first library catalog?
Arguably the world's first comprehensive library catalog and bibliographic database. He systematically indexed the contents. He classified them by author, by subject, by genre. He even provided the first lines of the text as an identifier.
So he basically invented the Dewey Decimal System 2,000 years early, but on this vast critical scale.
He did more than that. By creating a queryable engine of research, he transformed what could have been a vast, overwhelming archive into an active, functional knowledge generation machine.
It's the software that ran the hardware.
That's the perfect analogy. It was the crucial software that enabled the resident scholars, Eratosthenes, Euclid, Archimedes, Hero, Aristarchus, to connect the dots and to construct the future. The museum was the physical home, the library was the database, and the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐻 was the search engine.
That concentration of intellectual and organizational power, it led directly to these profound, tangible innovations. We're talking prototypes that were not just philosophy, but functional, working technology.
Yes, and this is the truly haunting part of this whole story.
It's the realization that the schematics housed in those scrolls were the ignition sequence for an industrial age 2,000 years early. We often hear this narrative that the ancients just lacked the capability for complex machinery.
A total myth.
The forensic evidence from Alexandria just explodes that myth completely.
And the centerpiece of that evidence is Hero of Alexandria. He was a scholar operating in the Alexandrian tradition around the 1st century AD, and he described in his treatise Pneumatica a device known as the eolipile.
Or the ball of Aeolus.
Right. And forensically, we can confirm this device operates on the exact fundamental principles that power all modern jet engines and steam turbines. Which are what, exactly? The conversion of thermal energy into kinetic energy via reactive thrust. It is a perfect demonstration of Newton's third law, centuries before Newton was even born.
Let's spend a minute on the technical anatomy of this machine, because it's not just some theoretical sketch on a piece of paper. This was a complete working system.
It is deceptive in its simplicity. The base was a sealed cauldron of water, basically a boiler. You'd heat it, the steam would generate pressure.
Standard stuff so far.
And that pressure would rise through vertical pipes into a hollow sphere mounted on top, on an axis so it could spin.
Okay.
Now, the crucial part is that the sphere had two L-shaped nozzles protruding from opposite sides, and they were aimed tangentially, so they weren't pointing straight out.
So as the pressurized steam escaped those nozzles,
The thrust, the reaction, caused the sphere to spin. And not just spin, but spin rapidly and continuously. It was a perfect self-sustaining conversion of fire into continuous high-speed rotational motion.
And for any engineer looking to mechanize work, rotational motion is the holy grail.
It's everything. It can drive a loom, turn a millstone, power a bellows, lift water. Modern reconstructions show that the eolipile could achieve speeds well over 1,000 RPM. This was proof positive that the ancients had the core technology for a steam engine.
And here is the great tragic irony. They had the engine, but they saw it as little more than a demonstration, a party trick.
That's the key disconnect right there. They possess the technology, but they culturally categorize it as a falmata, a wonder, an automaton to impress the uneducated.
So what did Hero use these principles for?
He used similar pneumatic principles for automated but very low-stakes devices. Self-opening temple doors, for example, operated by the displacement of air heated by altar fires.
Wow.
Or coin-operated vending machines that would dispense a little bit of holy water when you put a coin in. The principles for automation and mechanization were fully documented right there on the library shelves. But they were confined to novelty and ritual.
But Hero wasn't just inventing in a vacuum. His work was the culmination of an established lineage of high-precision engineering rooted in Alexandria. We have to talk about Ctesibius.
Ctesibius is fundamental. He flourished in the 3rd century BC, and he's often considered the first head of the museum. He's rightly known as the father of pneumatics. His contributions provide critical, tangible evidence of the advanced workshop practices that must have been documented in the library's archives.
His most famous device, the hydraulis, or water organ. It sounds like a musical instrument, but it was really a feat of engineering precision, wasn't it?
It was far more than musical.
Yep.
The hydraulis required incredibly complex, high-tolerance manufacturing. It used a water cistern, called an amidius, to compress and stabilize air pressure.
So it provided a steady stream of air.
A continuous flow of air through the pipes, which were played by a keyboard. Now, this demands precision engineering for the valves, for the pistons used to pump the air, and most importantly, the creation of perfect airtight seals. The very existence of the hydraulis confirms that Alexandrian engineers had mastered the control of fluids and gases under pressure.
Which is an absolute prerequisite for any kind of steam technology.
It is. And that mastery of high-tolerance cylinders and pistons directly led to powerful industrial components.
Like what?
Like the force pump. Ctesibius also designed the force pump, which was a twin-cylinder reciprocating pump fitted with highly efficient valves. This thing could produce a continuous high-pressure jet of water.
And that was powerful enough to be used in the real world.
The Romans adopted it for their fire engines. But the staggering implication here is that the presence of the force pump proves that these ancient workshops had the technical capacity to build durable, airtight cylinders and pistons.
The fundamental necessary components, not just for a turbine, but for a scaled, reciprocating steam engine.
Exactly. And then you have his improvements to the water clock, the clepsydra, which show their grasp of early automation and control theory.
How so?
His clock was a marvel. Ctesibius's clepsydra was the most accurate timekeeping device in the world until the 17th century pendulum clock. He used a carefully regulated flow of water to power a sophisticated rack and pinion gear system.
And this introduced a key engineering concept.
It introduced the concept of a feedback loop, a self-regulating mechanism, into their mechanical toolkit.
So we have the mathematical theory, we have the practical prototypes, we have the fundamental components, pistons, cylinders, precision gears, all confirmed and documented.
Yeah.
But if we encounter a skeptic, someone who argues that Hero's Pneumatica was just, theoretical scribbling, is there any piece of hardware that survived to prove this high-level engineering was real?
And that is when we turn to the ultimate piece of forensic evidence. The machine that proves the Alexandrian tradition was real. The 𝐏𝐻𝐃 mechanism.
The smoking gun.
It was discovered over a century ago in a shipwreck dating from around 150 to 100 BC. This device is the smoking gun that confirms these texts were not hyperbole. They were blueprints for reality.
It's often called the world's first analog computer, but let's go beyond that summary. What does the complexity of the 𝐏𝐻𝐃 mechanism actually tell us about Alexandrian manufacturing capability?
It was a bronze mechanism, roughly the size of a shoebox, and it contained at least 30 extremely complex meshing bronze gears. It was designed to predict astronomical phenomena.
Like eclipses.
Calculating eclipse cycles, yes. Tracking the moon's irregular speed, which is the first known instance of that kind of modeling. And it even displayed the dates for the 4-year Olympiad cycle.
30 gears requires immense manufacturing precision. I mean, we're not talking about rough carpentry here.
Absolutely not. The gears required high-tolerance machining. The gear teeth had to be perfectly cut, perfectly spaced with uniform dimensions for the machine to operate accurately at all. But even more than that, the mechanism contained an exceptionally complex component.
The differential gear.
The differential gear. This is a gear system that allows two inputs to drive a single output, or a single input to drive two separate outputs at varying speeds.
Which is the foundation of modern automotive mechanics.
And it was lost to Western civilization. It was not formally reinvented until the 14th century in Europe.
So the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐓 mechanism proves that the highly advanced mathematical theories that were archived in the library, the kinematics, the celestial mechanics, they were actively and repeatedly translated into precision mechanical engineering in the real world.
It confirms a high tradition of workshop practice. This isn't a single genius moment. A device of this complexity is too intricate. It's too demanding of resource allocation to be a one-off.
Its existence implies a whole network of experts.
A network of expert metallurgists, skilled artisans, standardized workshop practices. The library almost certainly housed the detailed fabrication guides, the metallurgy specifications, the instruction manuals for producing devices of this exact class. Documents that were later erased. Its survival validates the operational realism of the Aeola pile and the force pump.
So Act 2 has all its material evidence. The blueprints, the prototypes, the proof of concept hardware, and yet the tragedy remains, the failure to launch. Here's where it gets really interesting. We have to perform a socioeconomic autopsy. Why did the steam engine, the Aeola pile, remain a toy? Why didn't the Industrial Revolution begin in Alexandria in the 1st century AD?
And the discussion has to move from technology to culture and economics. The most famous explanation is what's known as the Finley thesis, named after the classical historian Moses Finley.
And what was his argument?
He argued, quite compellingly, that the sheer ubiquity and cheapness of human labor, specifically slavery, suffocated the economic incentive for adopting expensive, high-maintenance machinery.
It's a very elegant argument. Why commit huge amounts of capital to build a machine that requires specialized fuel, advanced metallurgy, constant maintenance?
When you have cheap, disposable, self-replicating human labor available on demand.
The cost-benefit analysis just doesn't work out for mechanization.
It doesn't. In a slave-based economy, the capital pressure that you need for that kind of innovation simply did not exist. And what's more, the Roman elite, the ones who controlled the vast pools of capital, they were culturally averse to industrial output.
Their wealth was in land?
Their wealth and prestige were rooted in land ownership, military conquest, political office, not in commerce, not in manufacturing, not in technological efficiency. There was no market demand driven by labor shortages or competitive manufacturing pressure.
And we also have to consider the genuine technical barriers. Even if the will had been there, the material science of the day was limited.
That is the essential nuance. While the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐓 era proves their precision and low-pressure gearing, scaling the Aeola pile up into a powerful high-torque engine requires high-pressure boilers.
Boilers that can withstand immense thermal stress.
Exactly. The bronze and cast iron of the era were adequate for low-pressure pneumatics, but scaling up for continuous industrial use would have demanded a leap forward in metallurgy, moving toward high-pressure, standardized steel.
And that was a technological bottleneck.
A bottleneck that would have been costly and dangerous to overcome without the full complement of the library's theoretical chemistry and physics, which were probably sitting right there on the shelf.
So to summarize this tragic equation, the library held the theoretical software, the math, and the physics, and the prototype hardware, mechanics, but it utterly lacked the critical economic driver.
Precisely. They missed the economic impetus, the necessity born of a pervasive labor shortage or a booming competitive middle-class market to force that technological integration.
And the final terrible tragedy is that the destruction of the library eliminated the option entirely.
Yes. Centuries later, during the late Roman Empire, when labor shortages due to plagues became common, a new generation of thinkers might have revisited Hero's blueprints and said, okay, now we must invest in mechanization.
But by then, the shelf was empty.
The knowledge base was irrevocably lost, and it condemned humanity to repeat the entire discovery process 1,500 years later.
If Act 2 detailed the loss of power, the physical tools to shape the world, Act 3 documents the loss of perspective. The library contained data that correctly situated humanity in the cosmos and accurately sized the planet, knowledge that was then buried under centuries of dogmatic, incorrect theory.
And the achievement of Eratosthenes of Cyrene, the third head librarian, is just. It's intellectually staggering. He performed one of the most elegant, low-tech, and accurate scientific experiments ever conceived.
And he used what? A stick?
A stick, a well, and Euclidean geometry.
Yeah.
That's it. And with that, he measured the entire circumference of the Earth.
Okay, walk us through the methodology, because it feels almost magical how accurate his result was with such limited instruments.
The methodology relies on a simple, brilliant observation and two key assumptions. Eratosthenes knew that on the summer solstice, at high noon, the sun shone directly down into a deep well in Syene, which is modern Aswan. It cast no shadow.
Okay.
He assumed the Earth was spherical and that the sun's rays arrived parallel to each other because the sun is so far away.
And simultaneously in Alexandria.
He measured the angle of the shadow cast by a vertical rod, a gnomon. And that angular difference between the two locations was the key.
What was the angle?
He calculated the angle to be approximately 7.2 degrees. Now, if the sun's rays are parallel, that 7.2-degree angle of the shadow is the same as the angle at the Earth's center between Syene and Alexandria.
And 7.2 degrees is exactly 150th of a full circle.
It is. So the distance between the two cities had to be 150th of the Earth's total circumference.
And his calculation was startlingly close to the truth.
He estimated the distance between the two cities to be roughly 5,000 stadia. You multiply that by 50, you get 250,000 stadia for the Earth's circumference. Now, this is where historical context matters. The length of the stadian unit varied a bit.
Right, it wasn't standardized.
No. But depending on which specific unit he used, his final answer ranges from an error of about 1% to maybe 16%.
So even at the worst-case scenario, his methodology, the ratio, was perfect.
Absolutely. The genius is in the methodology. He understood that he didn't need a spaceship. He needed sound geometric principles. At worst, he was off by a small percentage from the actual equatorial circumference of 40,075 kilometers. He proved the spherical nature and size of the Earth with astounding accuracy.
And he didn't stop there. He applied this knowledge to practical mapping.
He used his measurement as the foundation for his lost masterwork, the Geographica. This was a map that used a sophisticated grid system parallels and meridians, and it divided the known world into 5 distinct climate zones. This map was the absolute standard of geographical science.
And the loss of the Geographica is a monumental practical tragedy for the history of exploration.
It is, because later explorers, most famously Columbus, they were forced to rely on the far less accurate estimates provided by Claudius Ptolemy centuries later.
And Ptolemy's estimates were wrong.
They dramatically underestimated the size of the globe. Had Columbus possessed Eratosthenes' data, he would have known that the voyage west to Asia was geographically impossible, or at the very least, far, far longer than he planned. The absence of this accurate map led to a dangerous 1,700-year regression in our global perspective.
If Eratosthenes represents the loss of geographic perspective, then the most grievous cosmic loss has to be the work of Aristarchus of Samos.
Aristarchus is truly the lost Copernicus. He proposed a model of the solar system 1,800 years before the Renaissance, and while his full treatise on the subject is lost,
We have confirmation.
we have authoritative confirmation of his theory from the most reliable source imaginable, Archimedes, in his own work, The Sand Reckoner.
So what was this revolutionary proposition that Archimedes confirmed?
Archimedes explicitly stated that Aristarchus proposed that the fixed stars and the sun remain unmoved, and that the Earth revolves about the sun in the circumference of a circle.
The heliocentric model.
But more than that, Aristarchus correctly anticipated the central counter-argument to heliocentrism, stellar parallax. He reasoned that the stars didn't appear to shift position as the Earth moved because they were simply infinitely distant compared to the scale of the Earth's orbit. An incredible insight.
This ancient revelation was sitting on the library shelves, ready to accelerate astronomy. Why was it rejected? Why did we end up with the geocentric model dominating thought for over a millennium?
The rejection was rooted in the dominant philosophy and physics of the time, which was Aristotelian cosmology. To an Alexandrian scholar, the heliocentric idea was counterintuitive. It was folly.
Why?
Aristotelian physics stated that the Earth was the natural center of the universe. The natural state of all heavy objects was to seek that center. Therefore, if the Earth were spinning and revolving, 2 immediate questions came up that they just couldn't answer.
The first being, why aren't we all thrown off into space?
Exactly. If the Earth is moving at these incredible speeds, why don't clouds, birds, or a stone thrown into the air get instantly left behind by the rapidly moving planet? Without the concept of inertia or universal gravitation ideas that required centuries of mathematical development, the idea of a moving Earth was physically nonsensical.
So the obvious observational evidence, the sun rising and setting, won the day.
It did. And because that brilliant work by Aristarchus was lost, the geocentric model laid out by Ptolemy in his Almagest became canonized. It became the authoritative text for both the Islamic world and the Christian West.
And had Aristarchus's book survived instead?
The entire 1,400-year detour, where humanity placed itself immovably at the center of existence, might have been avoided. The trial of Galileo, the entire intellectual struggle of the early scientific revolution, arguably a direct consequence of a lost scroll in Alexandria.
And if Aristarchus is the great theoretical loss, we have an incredible case study that brings the technical loss right into the modern era, the Archimedes palimpsest. This is a microcosm, a perfect illustration of the library's destruction.
And the painstaking forensic recovery required to undo that kind of erasure. It is the single most compelling piece of evidence we have for the destruction of knowledge through repurposing and neglect.
So what's the story?
It begins centuries after Archimedes. His unique treatises were copied onto a codex-bound book, a relatively rare format at the time around the 10th century. Then, in 1229, a monk in Jerusalem named Johannes Myronis needed parchment for a Christian prayer book, a euchologion.
And parchment made from treated animal hides was unbelievably expensive and scarce in the medieval world. So they recycled.
He recycled perhaps the most important scientific document in history. He took the codex with Archimedes' original unique mathematical proofs, he unbound it, and he meticulously washed off the iron gall ink. That process is called palimpsesting.
And then he just wrote over it.
He cut the pages in half, rotated them 90 degrees, and wrote Christian prayers right over the faint mathematical Greek text. For 700 years, this prayer book hid the only surviving copies of Archimedes' most advanced works, including the method of mechanical theorems.
That is the definition of intellectual tragedy. The source code for the future scraped off and covered by standard devotional text. And the recovery process, it sounds like something out of a techno-thriller.
It required the fusion of particle physics and philology in the 21st century. The document was digitized, and then it was taken to the Stanford Linear Accelerator, a synchrotron, to be bombarded with high-intensity X-rays.
Why the synchrotron? Why X-rays?
Well, the original iron gall ink that the scribe used contained trace amounts of iron, and though it was invisible to the naked eye after centuries, the X-rays caused those iron atoms, and only the iron atoms, to fluoresce, to glow at specific wavelengths.
So you could see the original text again.
It allowed researchers to digitally separate the faint underlying scientific text from the superimposed prayer text. They could literally read the mathematics hidden beneath the prayers, the gold leaf, and the mold.
And the revelation unearthed by this forensic science was enormous.
It fundamentally shifted our understanding of mathematical history. The method of mechanical theorems showed that Archimedes was using infinitesimals, the conceptual building blocks for modern integral calculus, to calculate the area and volume of complex shapes.
He was using a technique that was basically calculus.
A technique virtually indistinguishable from the methods later invented independently by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in the late 17th century. So had this one manuscript, or the hundreds of others like it in the library, remained in circulation, mathematics could have accelerated by at least 5 centuries. The loss wasn't just aesthetic. It was a physical, measurable loss of intellectual continuity.
We have to turn now to the physical destruction of the library, and we have to correct the biggest popular myth, which is the idea of a single, definitive fire.
Yes. The forensic timeline overwhelmingly suggests that the library died the death of 1,000 cuts. It was a long, drawn-out attrition caused by riot, theft, neglect, and multiple distinct phases of destructive activity spanning over 700 years.
Let's break down that timeline into 4 distinct phases of cultural failure. We'll start with Phase 1, the collateral damage of 48 BC, involving Julius Caesar.
Right. During the Alexandrian War, Caesar found himself in a very precarious position, besieged in the royal palace. To prevent the Egyptian fleet from using their ships and supplies, he ordered the vessels in the harbor to be burned.
And the fire spread.
It spread rapidly from the docks to the shore warehouses. And we have accounts from ancient sources like Seneca and Plutarch who cite the destruction of around 40,000 scrolls in that specific event.
Which is a staggering loss. That's like gutting a major modern library acquisition center.
It is. However, detailed forensic analysis suggests this fire primarily consumed a warehouse or an annex containing the 𝐏𝐻𝐃, the aggressively acquired unprocessed books.
And books from the ships.
Exactly. Or export copies intended for shipment. Crucially, the main museum complex, the engine of research, was not destroyed. We know this because the geographer Strabo visited Alexandria decades later, around 20 BC, and described the museum as a fully functioning, vibrant research institution.
So Caesar inflicted a serious wound, but not the fatal blow.
A crippling wound to the collection, yes, but not to the entire intellectual structure.
Okay, the next phase, Phase 2, is arguably more culturally significant because it was a targeted ideological strike, the religious purge of 391 AD. And the suspect here is Theophilus, the Patriarch of Alexandria.
By the late 4th century, the geopolitical landscape had changed completely. The Roman Empire had officially Christianized. Emperor Theodosius issued decrees systematically banning all forms of pagan worship throughout the empire.
And Theophilus, a highly militant Christian bishop, saw the collections as a threat.
He viewed the vast collections, particularly the daughter library housed in the Serapeum temple complex, as the last bastion of pagan philosophy, a direct intellectual threat to the new Christian dogma.
And unlike Caesar's accidental fire, this was direct action against the institution itself.
It was a targeted, deliberate act of intellectual vandalism. Theophilus led a mob to the Serapeum, which wasn't just a temple. It served as the open-access public collections branch of the library.
And it was leveled.
The complex was leveled, the idols were destroyed, and presumably the vast collection of pagan or secular texts housed there were purged. This marks a critical transition, the moment when the preservation of knowledge became entirely secondary to the enforcement of religious and political dogma.
Then comes Phase 3, the symbolic and perhaps most tragic death, which broke the chain of intellectual lineage. The brutal murder of Hypatia in 415 AD.
Hypatia was a brilliant mathematician, an astronomer, a Neoplatonic philosopher. She was the daughter of Theon, who was the last attested scholar affiliated with the original museum lineage. Her death signaled the final violent collapse of secular critical inquiry in Alexandria.
And the nature of her death, being dragged from her chariot, flayed alive with sharp tiles or oyster shells, and dismembered by a Christian mob. It's a horrific symbol of the end of that whole intellectual tradition.
It's the ultimate act of anti-intellectual terrorism. And while no books may have burned in that specific moment, the murder effectively dissolved the living library,
The teachers, the students.
the philosophical debate. It signaled to any remaining scholars that secular science was now a lethal enterprise in Alexandria. The city was no longer a safe haven for free inquiry. The academic ecosystem scattered or simply ceased to exist. The tradition was broken.
Which brings us to the famous final narrative. Phase 4, the final erasure of 642 AD, attributed to the Arab conquest. This is where that powerful but likely apocryphal story takes hold.
The famous story, which has survived for centuries, alleges that the general Amir ibn al-Als asked Caliph Omar what should be done with the remaining books.
And Omar's reply, which you find quoted everywhere,
is, if those books are in agreement with the Quran, we have no need of them, and if these are opposed to the Quran, destroy them. The tale concludes that the remaining books fueled the city's 4,000 public bathhouses for 6 months.
But our forensic audit of the historical sources casts serious doubt on this. Why is that story likely fictional?
The timing is the key issue. The first known recording of this anecdote appears in a text by Bar Hebraeus, written in the 13th century. That's nearly 600 years after the Arab conquest.
So it's not a contemporary source.
Not at all. And by 642 AD, the Great Library, the Museum, the Serapeum, they were already functionally dead. They had suffered centuries of budget cuts, systemic theft, Caesar's fire, and the full-scale destruction of the Serapeum by Theophilus in 391. The consensus among serious historians is that there would have been very little left to burn, if anything at all, when the Arabs arrived.
So the library wasn't killed by a single villain in a single night. It was murdered over centuries by 3 compounding forces: the collateral damage of war, organized religious dogmatism, and
perhaps most insidiously, political apathy. Chronic underfunding and bureaucratic neglect in the late Roman period. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. The true failure was the inability of successive governments, Roman or local, to recognize and actively defend the central importance of their collective knowledge base.
now that we have established the operational genius and forensically analyzed the timeline of destruction, we have to attempt the impossible, quantifying the catastrophe. When we look at the inventory of loss, the scale of what we don't know is it's heartbreaking.
The statistics are devastating. In literature, we can measure the probability of survival for ancient texts, and it is vanishingly small. Of the 120 plays Sophocles is known to have written, we possess only 7.
Just 7.
The vast narrative scope of the epic cycle, the poems that described events between the Iliad and the Odyssey, is gone. It survives only in scattered summaries. We lost the complete cultural soul of the pre-Christian West.
And the scientific loss is even more critical for the trajectory of human progress. We lost the full treatise detailing Aristarchus's heliocentric model, the specific engineering manuals of Ctesibius that detailed high-precision mechanics,
And the complete anatomical notes of Herophilus, the Alexandrian physician who first correctly differentiated between the nervous system motor and sensory nerves and the circulatory system. That knowledge was wiped out, forcing medicine to regress for a millennium until the Renaissance. We also lost immense historical perspective. The memoirs of the Ptolemaic kings, histories of the Etruscans, the vast majority of Livy's massive 142-book history of Rome.
Of which only 35 survive.
Only 35. The loss wasn't just data, it was the loss of multiple perspectives on our own past.
The conclusion of our audit is stark. The Great Library of Alexandria was actively murdered by the very forces it sought to eliminate: war, dogmatism, and intellectual and political apathy. This tragedy, though, it forces us into a chilling and necessary modern comparison.
That is the crucial final connection. Just as the library was a centralized, fragile, physical repository of human data, the modern internet is our equally centralized and equally vulnerable database of humanity. We are, in many respects, living through the beginnings of a digital dark age.
And we see this fragility manifesting today in a concept called link rot. Digital resources just vanish because servers are decommissioned, URLs expire, or proprietary formats become unreadable. This is the digital equivalent of papyrus scrolls rotting in the delta's humidity.
And we have seen mass cultural erasure happen almost overnight. Take the MySpace lesson from 2019. The company admitted to losing 12 years of music, photos, and personal data during a server migration.
A massive, unannounced, corporate-level deletion of personal and cultural history.
Or the deletion of Yahoo's GeoCities, which wiped out a massive archive of early personal internet expression and history. It left only the fragments that were salvaged by dedicated nonprofit institutions. These are our modern burning libraries, unintentionally incinerated by format obsolescence and corporate neglect.
And the Internet Archive, our modern Alexandria, which attempts to cache the entire web, it faces constant legal challenges, financial peril, and the overwhelming technical challenge of maintaining billions of links.
The lesson from antiquity is brutally clear. Knowledge is not permanent. It requires active, costly, and continuous defense against indifference, economics, and ideology. The loss of Alexandria forces us to confront the terrifying reality that progress is not an inevitable upward march. It is contingent upon protecting the accumulated data.
In Alexandria, humanity fell off the tightrope, taking the future with it. The 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓 sat on a shelf, a curiosity, while the sophisticated empire that housed it slowly decayed around it. Let's quickly summarize the most shocking facts we've uncovered in this deep dive. The Alexandrian Greeks had a functional steam engine prototype. They possessed the conceptual methods of integral calculus 2,000 years early, and they accurately measured the Earth's size within an incredibly small margin of error.
So what does this all mean? The ultimate difference between us and antiquity wasn't intellectual capacity. It was continuity. They had the geniuses, they had the blueprints, but they failed to protect the database that housed those blueprints long enough for economic pressure or demographic shifts or subsequent generations of scholars to transform that theory into civilization-altering application.
And that leaves us with a provocative final thought, something for you to consider long after this deep dive is over. The Industrial Revolution, the rise of modern science, it was not a foregone historical conclusion. It was a historical accident that was nearly thwarted, not by a lack of intellectual firepower, but by a lack of political and economic will to value knowledge over cheap human labor and religious dogma.
So consider this. What unknown solutions or advances, perhaps the cure for a modern disease or the blueprint for solving climate change, are sitting in vulnerable, decentralized digital archives today, waiting to be scraped off for something considered more immediately practical, more profitable, or more devotionally significant? What is our modern equivalent of the Archimedes palimpsest, waiting for the synchrotron X-rays before it's too late?